Thanks so much, Caitlin. We're going to jump right into our next presentation. So Alex, do you want to come up and we'll get going? So it brings me great excitement to launch our first report of the day. Alex Howard, who many of you know, is just an immensely intelligent and prolific blogger, writer, journalist, working at the intersection of government, governance, data, and technology. And he came to us about 8 months ago and said he wanted to do a big picture scan of the world of data journalism. And one of the things we found that happens in the data journalism conversation, which is a wonderful offshoot of it getting more and more sophisticated, is we're getting more and more people with deep, deep expertise in computer science and natural language processing and statistics. And what we wanted to do with this report was step back from that very specialized conversation and do a scan of where the state of the practice was. And that's what Alex did over the last year. He talked to literally a who's who of the people in the data journalism world. I highly recommend looking at the interviews he's published on our website throughout the year. He's done transcripts of a lot of the interviews of the people he's talked to, and the report is now live on the website. So Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, which one is it? Science?
Yep.
All right.
Can we get the screen turned on here?
No, Microsoft, please do not update this right now. Which one?
Sorry.
It's all good. Podium laptop? Yes. Hey, that looks good.
And then, yeah, there you go.
Okay. So good morning, everybody, and good morning to the internet, because I know that people are watching online as well. I tried to write this and create this presentation, create this report in a way that would be accessible to the general public, along with the people assembled at Columbia Journalism School and beyond. I wanted to make sure this was accessible to as many people as possible. I know data journalism as an idea has been getting a lot of hype in the last year, certainly, and the past couple years. So I want to dig back into some more context about it and to talk about these things. So, if you're like me, you're a fan of fantasy and science fiction, and you might know Game of Thrones, and you might know this quote that kind of went a little bit viral from one of the characters, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." But if we look back in history, a fellow named Jon Snow did know something. He actually looked at where cholera was popping up in London and was able to find a correlation between wells and where these cases were coming up. And it's one of the first really great examples of first some data visualization and also some data-driven insight, extracting knowledge from mapping something. And that's, I think, an important jumping off point. Newspapers, journalists have been using data for centuries. If you look back at what newspapers first were, those handwritten things that were passed around in the Renaissance world from merchants, they were offering some data on the price of commodities or economic conditions. If you go all the way back to early Chinese Empire, the Romans, they were passing around forms of data as well. They're coming from government, not official journalists, but nonetheless, data was part of communication. So that's not a new idea to have data be part of the media and be part of the sourcing. And the difference, I think, in terms of where things get a little bit shifted is when computers come into this world. And it's not something that happened quickly. There was an inflection point back in 1952 when the ENIAC computer was used by CBS News to predict the outcome of the election. Guess what? Grace Hopper, computing pioneer, was able to create an algorithm that accurately predicted that outcome, with only 8% of the election returns came in. CBS actually didn't broadcast that at the time because they were so concerned that it was ahead of the actual news itself. But data has been used combined with programming for quite a long time. In the 60s, it started to take off because of some early pioneers, people like Philip Meyer and his idea of precision journalism, applying social sciences and statistics to understanding what's happening in immense amounts of data. And so there's traditional tools where this has been applied. If people look at the practice of computer-assisted reporting, they know the history of this. Calculators and graphs, mainframes, PCs, spreadsheets, databases, text and code editors, stats, and yes, some kinds of programming. Now, the big shift in this space, as many people here know in this seat of digital journalism, is one used to have the internet and then, thank you very much, and the World Wide Web, mobile phones and social networking connecting us to each other, and then this huge surge in data creation over the last decade. Now there's basically as much data as existed in human history being created more or less every year, and that pace is just going up and up as more and more devices come online. So-called Internet of Things, many more sensors, all these other things are creating data that can be used and mined. So this fellow, Tim Berners-Lee, back in 2010 said that this space is the future. Now, if he were a little more grounded in the context that just brought in, he might also say, well, it's also our present and past, too. The difference is you're calling it something new. There are some different contextual reasons we think of it as something that is a bit new, because the spreadsheets have moved online, because there are wikis, because there are powerful new data visualization tools, because there are open source frameworks and code bases, because people are sharing code back and forth. They're doing agile development, borrowing from the best practices of the tech industry. They're doing all kinds of cloud storage and processing, putting up data and outsourcing the processing tasks elsewhere. There's a lot more data, as I mentioned, and there's also new privacy and security risks. So in this moment, where data journalism is our present, where people are using that term now to describe what used to be called often as computer-assisted reporting, we can think of this as a definition for this. It's a little bit unwieldy. We're thinking of gathering, cleaning, organizing, analyzing, visualizing, and publishing data to support the creation of acts of journalism. The short version of that is treating data as a source, just in the same way you would treat a person as a source, something that you interrogate, something you seek to understand. And this got popularized quite a bit by the Guardian data blog, a fellow named Simon Rogers, who gave a great talk here at Columbia not so long ago. He's now Twitter's data editor, and you can follow him on Twitter to see all the things he's doing with access to the full fire hose of Twitter data. You can see all the use of these different tools, and what he popularized is a populist version of data journalism. He says you don't have to be a programmer to do this stuff because of these new web-based tools, because of things like Fusion tables and Tableau, because of the different frameworks that exist that allow non-programmers to do data visualizations. There are some issues with that, but we can get back to that. This is a trendy thing, but not a new thing. Collection, protection, interrogation of data as a source, complementing traditional shoe leather reporting, right? Giving people other kinds of data and sources that complement the investigations when data interviews. And this has been going on for some time. This was built by the Washington Post back in 2005, 2006. It's still online, built by Derek Willis and some other folks who did, I think, a great job in showing what might be possible here and what could be built in terms of a living story that was populated. And you can still go back and dig into this very app. ProPublica has now pioneered the space. They've, I think, done as much as anyone to discuss what a news application can be and show it how it can be made. They've put a style guide online. They've created best practices. They've shown what can be done in creating stories that continue to live on, updated with data, showed transparency in doing so. The Guardian has pushed lots of I think, into this space. The data blog has continued after Simon Rogers left. The Chicago Tribune has done great work in this space, combining its investigations with news apps and other kinds of visualizations. You got the Wall Street Journal that's definitely punching in the space. Their interactives are very impressive. Here's another piece from ProPublica, incredibly difficult topic, the tangled web of money donations behind the Koch brothers. They managed to put that all together and make it explorable. The New York Times absolutely is very much in this. I think, and if you look through the report, it's called them the New York Yankees of data journalism because they are in New York, and because they have a huge budget, and because they often will pull people from other people's farm teams and bring them on their club. They've got their own farm team too, though, of course. The Los Angeles Times has actually done fantastic work with a smaller staff. They've espoused a number of the principles I think that are important. I'll go through later. The Texas Tribune has shown how this can be done at a state and local level. Their data is a huge part of what they do. It accounts for a large part of the traffic to their site. La Nacion, there's two different La Naciones to talk about. One is in Costa Rica, the other one is down in Argentina. They both have done incredibly impressive work using these free open source web-based tools, in many cases holding the powerful to account. It's an important theme throughout this space. Reuters is in this world too. They've done, I think, something called Connected China. I recommend highly checking that out because of the way it shows you can the influence, the movements of money, the movements of power in a country where the business and political elite are quite pulled together, and maybe press isn't quite as robust as it might be. Wired Italy, actually, is a notable example of this. They've mapped earthquake risks in schools and allowed people to look and see what risks their schools had, whether they were maintained or not. Right here in New York City, WNYC has done terrific work as well, taking data from New York and then putting it into spaces. This was the evacuation zones. Of course, if you live here, you know very well people were asked to evacuate, but many New Yorkers had never known what evacuation zones they live in. WNYC got the data from New York City, and when New York City, nyc.gov went down, they actually put this online, and this was seen by 10 times as many people as went to the government website. La Nacion's Voz Dead, I mentioned that before, that their, I think, exploration of data in the political context is quite important. So just a couple quick examples. If you read the report, you'll see a lot more. I tried to be comprehensive. It's not exhaustive. Inevitably, I'm sure I missed some terrific organizations or people, and my apologies. We can continue to talk online about this or add more over time. But let's get a little bit more into some of the emerging best practices I heard from people, and maybe think about what might make sense for others who want to get involved in the space. The first is this: if you see things in the data, pick up the phone, report it out. The WikiLeaks data is a great example of that. You've got all these huge amounts of cables. You can start to graph interesting things about them, but you need to actually go through and validate what's that data telling you. Same thing was true in this recent gigantic Medicare database of the costs for various procedures around doctors. You need to understand why those costs were so high. Report that out. As is true in almost any kind of journalism, show some people something new. Why does it matter? What does it matter to them? In this case, NPR has a news app that lets you see what the fire forecast is, and you can geolocate that relevant to yourself. Right? Put in a zip code, understand something about the world, tell a story. This is still one of the things you cannot forget in all this space. People respond to narratives, not just to a spreadsheet. There are going to be people who want to explore that data, who explore the methodology, explore the code, but a lot of the audience just wants to know, what's the story? What matters to me here? Well, in this case, Pulitzer Prize-winning report from Paul Hamby, Center for Public Integrity, looked at the issues around the coal industry in black lung and found that there was one doctor here who never found a case of it for some reason. There's a story there. One of the people I interviewed about this, Anthony DeBarros, actually he's at Gannett now, no longer USA Today, reminded me of this early on, said, this is just another set of tools, but the story itself still matters. And at some point, we're going to drop the data journalism thing, just go back to journalism, just in the same way we talk about social journalism. It'll just become journalism again, because we don't talk about telephone journalism or email journalism. It's just journalism. Anybody recognize what this graph is, or what these images are from? This is the most popular content on NewYorkTimes.com last year. It was a dialect quiz built by an intern who's a grad student who now works on the Upshot, their data-driven site. And using a bunch of data on this quiz, it was able to locate quite precisely where you came from. It nailed me. Upstate New York, Philadelphia. Got it down to a science. Literally, you could see where the break was. That kind of thing is quite sticky, it's quite interesting, it's quite engaging. If you're going to work in this space, or look at people working in this space, the context for data is hugely important. This came up recently at 538, a new data journalism site that Nate Silver launched under ESPN. They looked at kidnappings, and there was this big jump in the federal capital territory. It's like, wait a second, are there all these kidnappings in the capital? Well, no, actually, these were media reports about kidnappings. And these particular, this data set kept defaulting to the capital. So if there's no location, it all went into the capital. So in fact, this is incredibly misleading. The context for the data has been shorn from the graph itself, even in the post itself. This is a little controversial. There are some contexts where putting your data online with a story may actually be problematic. But wherever possible, people want to see the data so they can look and check your work. Show your work, show your data. ProPublica has been a leader in this space. I think it's a best practice that many other organizations can and should follow. The new data journalism wave of startups is not, unfortunately. I looked at, I think, 290 odd stories that hit the RSS feed at 538. I looked at, I think, the 100 odd features that had gone up. I think 10 of them had the data shared on GitHub. That's not showing your work as completely as it could. Now, it takes more time to do that, but it enables the really critical audience, many people sitting in this room and elsewhere, to go and evaluate whether your methodology was accurate or not. And believe me, they're going to. So, show your work. Upshot did that. They had a huge front page story about economic of the middle class in the United States, and they shared the model, they shared the code, they shared the methodology on GitHub. People could go look at that and see what was behind the story. NPR has also been a leader in this space. If you go to GitHub, you can see a lot of the code they're releasing. They've got a couple challenges. Public media can't always release their code publicly, as it turns out, but they're sharing what they can. The ethics of this space are complicated but really important. Some issues are pretty old, some of them are new. Is the data clean? Is it representative? What biases are hidden there? Who's represented, who's not? How is it collected? Who was it not collected about? Was the data legally obtained? This is kind of a key question. Does it include personally identifiable information? So by publishing it, might you actually be hurting someone who's powerless or not? Often we think about public officials as being public, but private citizens who might have their information revealed, not so much. The collection issue is an important one. Do you give people the opportunity to opt out? Did you tell them how your data was going to be used if you're gathering it from, for those purposes? Have you given them a better version than just notice and consent? Because people click those end user license agreements very quickly, or terms of consent, they just go right through them. If you're thinking about the same things that the tech companies are running into, where they're not thinking about privacy from the beginning, and you're making a news application or visualization, you're going to run into trouble. So, take the Hippocratic Oath if you're going to do data journalism. There's some significant issues around data analysis and numeracy. I don't want to spend too much time up here because we could just talk about numeracy in the media, but one of the consistent themes I heard was that it needs to get better, that people need to be able to understand the basics about average versus mean, of significance, of correlation not being the causation, of what a regression is, of sharing a p-value, of r-value, of understanding the size of the study and why that might matter. These are basic statistical concepts. I had to go through them as a biology major, but I'm not sure that all journalism practitioners did. And I think if everyone's going to try to do this, or at least a lot more people are, then this is going to be a ground. If you see someone show a map that looks like this as evidence of anything, don't buy it. It's just population density. You need something more than that. If you see graphs like this, anybody see something wrong with this? It's flipped. It's misleading. That should be the other way around. The way it looks is like gun deaths plummeted after stand your ground law. In fact, it's the other way around. You can lie with data very easily. This is not perfect truth. It's very easy to twist these things. If you want to see more examples of this, go to WTFviz.net. There are lots of examples of bad data visualization. People need to think about presenting the data in context. I know I mentioned this before. The Times and lots of other organizations rushed to get Medicare data online. It was a huge data set. It was downloaded 100,000 times within a week. And it allowed you to look for a given doctor and see how much they were getting from Medicare. Powerful thing, but without the context, you don't know why they were getting it. Great follow-up from ProPublica to get into that. And I mentioned the privacy issues. When you combine multiple data sets, you could start to get a lot more information about who is described by them. Journalism organizations that collect lots of data and publish lots of data need to start thinking about the mosaic effect and what they might be enabling or not. There are secondary or tertiary effects from publishing data that may be unanticipated. And if you're going to be responsible, going to be ethical, that needs to be part of the conversation. So here's one of the fun bits. What did I see over the last couple of years doing this? Well, geojournalism. This is actually a pretty interesting space. Using satellite data, using shapefiles, using tiles, using lots of powerful free and open source tools to map what's happening looking way down. InfoAmazonia.org is a great example of that. You're seeing the network reporting from organizations spanning multiple countries. 80 different journalists, 40 different organizations, 260 gigabytes of data mapped out in offshore leaks. That's 10x the size of the WikiLeaks dump. Increasingly, this kind of work will be shared across multiple newsrooms across multiple countries, particularly as press freedoms are challenged in different areas. I think we'll see these transnational organizations of journalists report on something that might be a little bit difficult for them to do domestically, but they'll be shared elsewhere. You saw this happen with the Snowden leaks, most notably recently. There'll be more of that to come. Here's one of the most interesting parts, and we'll hear more about this later from my colleagues here at the Tao Center, about what data journalists can do. Back in the early days of this space, people were scraping and scraping, writing automated scripts to pull stuff off of websites, to grab data from APIs if they existed, to digitize things, to make the data from those areas, to get the data. There's also the FOIA, right, Freedom of Information Act, or FOIL here in New York, saying, give us this data. Increasingly, journalism organizations can make the data themselves. Now, they have to think about all the stuff I mentioned before around collection, biases, security, but that's part of the story. And you can get inspiration from what's happening in the civic hacking space, the citizen science space, where people are making open source hardware to collect data in new ways. That open source Geiger counter was used along with other Geiger counters and combined the data from those sensors with data from government to make this map of radiation plumes in Japan after the Fukushima earthquake, or earthquake at Fukushima rather, caused by, or the tsunami that hit after the earthquake. There we go, got it in the right order. And you can see other examples like a bus route in Nairobi where data is created as well. So you can start to see how these things can be made useful to people. This can make a dandy app if you want to pull the data sources into it. Now, censor journalism is pretty hot, and Fergus is going to talk about that later today. But this is from 2008, where the AP sent out its reporters, and I think the BBC did as well, and had two expensive instruments to measure particulate in the air and then graphed it, and could see there actually was an impact from the Chinese government shutting down industry outside of the city. There was an effect from that. Now, the US Embassy there is continuing to release data as we speak about air quality that can also be used in interesting ways to understand what's happening in those places. So the data from sensors can be used in censor journalism. Here in New York, WNYC did a fascinating crowdsourcing project where they encouraged people to make their own sensors and then track soil temperature and report when cicadas came out. Citizen science, crowdsourcing, people formerly known as the audience collaborating together to create something that can then inform us about what's something interesting that's happened, in this case, big scary bugs. And the NPR data team, they're now the data viz team or interactive team, did something fascinating here where they got together the best data set they could of playgrounds that were accessible in the country and then asked their audience to tell them where there were playgrounds that were accessible near them. They started out with hundreds of data sets, hundreds of data points rather. Now there are over 1,900 because the NPR audience collaborated with them in creating data, and then they put it back into the application and made the data itself available for anyone else who wanted to use it. This is not just a thing that's happening here. These kinds of resources can and will be used elsewhere, and the data from them will be used for accountability. In this case, in Andhra Pradesh in India, you've got a system where people are taking pictures of waste, reporting it to government. That data can and could be used by journalists to understand how the relationship between citizens reporting that there's a refuse issue and then government actually responding to it is happening or not. Drones are often thought of in the context of pictures, but they will be used for data collection. All you have to think about is what happens when you have a toxic environment or a disaster or some other thing that's awful and dangerous for humans. We'll send in the robot. Unfortunately, if 9/11 happened today, you would absolutely see drones buzzing around downtown Manhattan because they would be the only ones that media organizations might feel safe putting on the ground there. And they'd be right because of what was in the air. I mentioned the privacy challenges. They're significant here. Again, if you're working with raw data that's been given to you or leaked to you or been acquired, you need to think about what's described in it and who's described in it. The Iraqi deaths in WikiLeaks, this is an example of where mapping this out, not as much of an issue because you didn't have the names here. It's just showing where the graph is. So here's something a little bit touchy. There's been a growth in an open data, right? Data that's in a machine-readable format, it's free to use, and free to be reused over the last 5 years, something that's released by a government, certainly, but also released by media organizations, nonprofits, scientific organizations, big institutions like the World Bank, huge amounts of data flowing online. That's the disclosures that these organizations are choosing to make versus those that journalists are kind of getting from them. And so there's this huge amount of data flowing now. You've got startups like Enigma saying, here's all the data we've collected from these public organizations that you can come and get. You've got the World Bank publishing data. You've got social data that's now flowing online, something people who monitor and mine Facebook or Twitter are able to get through. I mentioned the Open Government Data platform, data.gov.uk, data.gov in the US have now, between them, hundreds of thousands of data sets. And the trouble is that a lot of that data is released in this form. If you talk to data journalists over time, they struggle with this. You've got data captured in there. So there's actually this wonderful explosion of tools which allow people to extract data from PDFs, right, to get that insight, to put it to use, to pull out what was trapped before. And a lot of these governments and organizations want to claim credit for opening stuff up and try to give them that, but also chivvy them along to do it better. Right? To not release something with a really difficult license, to not have something which doesn't allow for reuse, that has issues with quality or with formats. These are all things that journalists can and should be challenging. And this is a little bit dated. I could go back and update it to today where the US has dropped a little bit because of the surveillance issues. But the challenge is that many of the same countries that are claiming victories for open government because of their open data releases may also be somewhat restrictive on press freedom. It's the job of data journalists working with the media to actually, within the media, to call BS on that. To say that you may be releasing this data, but when it comes to actually reporting upon what people in power are doing, there's a challenge. And if you don't think that there's a distinct relationship between data collection and power, look deeper. The people who are powerful in society are often the ones who can prevent data being collected about them. And often the journalists will be the ones who mine the records, who go through and make that connection. This is an important thing, to say the least. The trust in the media that we see right now is not very high. So these kinds of source collection methods, I think, are incredibly important to restoring some of that. It won't go all the way. You've got to be actually right when you report on these things, when you create knowledge from these masses of data. But there is a chance to recover some of that by using this as complement to investigations. Again, I mentioned this work at the Center for Public Integrity. I think it's really important because people don't always realize that most of the Pulitzers that get awarded now have data as a component in the investigations. Doesn't always, come clear when their awards come out, but there's often a data story behind them. And these stories are really important for finding this next generation of difficult stories. If you look at this last week, the FTC just released a big report on data brokers. The last couple months, we've seen a report on big data and privacy from the President's Council of Science and Technology Advisors and from the White House's review. They all said that this gigantic explosion in data, all these data sets pulled together, create new risks for discrimination and significant harms. If you know the history of the United States, you know that people have been discriminated against because of their sex, because of their race, because of other issues of status. When you pull together all these data sets, the profiles that are combined about us between commercial, government, and social profiles that exist, they can be used against people. Now, the FTC says they didn't find any examples of it, but I guarantee we will. I wish it weren't true, but we're going to see personalized redlining in the United States. We're certainly going to see it in other countries. And people who understand data and statistics and can look deeper will find examples of it. I know this because the Wall Street Journal found geographic profiling already, where websites were varying pricing based upon user information in Iowa. Now, this is Staples. The Journal had to be very careful about how it collected data and thought about publishing it, but this is going to be part of our world. Data journalism will be part of finding it. Again, sourcing, reporting, investigating, complementing the data, but it's going to be part of that space. And you'll see some tools that have gotten knocked for uses in counterterrorism, like Palantir, which I'm showing here, used for other issues around human tissue tracking, or other kinds of investigations where you're looking at complex networks of sources and of data and seeing the relationships and the movements between them. In the US, we're a little bit uncomfortable with putting advocacy and journalism very close together. In other places, maybe not as much. They're moving towards other ways of doing journalism where advocacy is part and parcel of the space. In Kenya, someone who went to a data journalism boot camp, who used the tools, was able to take data, look at schools, figure out that there was a correlation between schools that didn't have sanitary facilities and young girls dropping out. Anyone guess why that was happening? They were menstruating. They're getting their period, and when that happened, they didn't have a place to go, so they were getting ostracized by their peers. So she built a tool that allowed parents to see if their children in schools had facilities or not, and then advocate to the local government to fix that. Direct connection between the investigation and then the outcome and policy. I know this is a little uncomfortable for some journalism institutions, but we're going to see more of it, and I think the world's going to be a better place for it. So here's the fun part, for me at least. I got to prognosticate upon what's coming, maybe what should be done. I mentioned some of the values earlier. This one's kind of a gimme, but data is a strategic resource. If information is power, data that you can get knowledge from, right? Data, information, knowledge, wisdom, if you can get that, you have something strategic. And the data that news organizations already have is strategic, even if they're not thinking about it already. One of the most important things the New York Times did this year is launch cooking.newyorktimes.com. Why? Because they're starting to mine their archives of data. The big innovation report that got leaked said they need to structure their archives better. Every news organization needs to structure those archives better because there's knowledge in there. Longitudinal knowledge. Some of it may be more qualitative than quantitative, but there's something valuable there. For countries that don't have government records that are that great, sometimes these media accounts are where the knowledge and the history of the country is. That's incredibly important. I mentioned Simon Rogers and the data blog and the kind of democratization, the populism around this. He said, anyone can do this. He said, data journalism is the new punk. Because anyone can learn punk. Now, people said, yeah, there's a lot of bad punk music, man. And that's true. Right? You give me a guitar and I can barely remember how to get through the different chords. But the fact is that we all can learn these things over time. It's possible. There's a data journalism MOOC, massive open online course going on right now, started last week actually. 21,000 people registered from all around the world. Some of them might be listening right now. There is a huge interest in learning how to use these things, and it's possible for people to do that. Now, are they going to get to the highest edges of computational journalism, where they're writing algorithms, they're building complex models, they're doing machine learning, natural language processing? No, not right away. People have to learn how to program, how to think algorithmically, how to code, to use the popular way of thinking about this now, to get to that level. But there's a lot that we can do where you can simply do using statistics to compare things and then pull them into a map or a table. That's the ground floor here. News apps are not going to become the way people consume data journalism. I think narratives and stories are still very important, the investigative side that pulls humans in. But we're going to see more and more news applications that fulfill what Adrian Holovati talked about back in 2006. Where things live on, even if somebody isn't directly going to them every day, because the data feeds are going into them and they're updated. They will become one of the primary ways that people consume this stuff. They may want to go click into the data themselves, but most of all, they're going to see, how does this apply to me? Most popular content on the BBC website last year was a quiz about class. It's not an accident. The BBC and the New York Times both had incredibly popular content that allowed people to look at something that told them something about themselves, which they could then share. Now, the Brits are pretty focused on class. I guess we're pretty focused upon accent. This is probably another one of these obvious points to make in the context of the Tao Center Digital Journalism in Columbia. But if you're going to be digital first, you need to be data-centric and designed for mobile. Design for mobile first. This is something Brian Boyer at the New York Times hit me with again and again and again. Think about that 2x3 inch screen first and then be able to stretch it elsewhere. Think about being responsive and design for the web, right? Think about these open standards in a way that allow people to access your content wherever you are. And understand that you're going to be competing as news organizations for attention with tech companies and startups that are doing it better, in cases a lot better. Both Facebook and Google and other people are trying to, corporations are people, are actually focused upon the insight game as well. Taking all this data and giving you some information about the world you're living in. So news organizations are competing with them for attention. Good luck. This is going to make some folks uncomfortable, but the reality is if you can't write a story better than the robot, they're going to beat you. Narrative science, a startup everyone here should learn about, is in this game. They're making commodity news, little league, sports reporting, that's pretty much indistinguishable from the 23-year-old beat reporter you might send down there. Earlier this year, the LA earthquake, first story out of the gate was written by an algorithm from the Los Angeles Times. It was a short story, I think 5, 6 sentences, but it shows you where the space is going. If you can write something and publish something that was developed by a machine, you better watch out, because they are coming. So find other ways to add value. Find the relationships, the reporting, the storytelling, the context, the extra value you can add on top of the data, because otherwise you're not adding something that costs a lot less can do. More journalists will need to study the social sciences. When Philip Meyer introduced precision journalism back in the 60s and studied the riots in Detroit, he's able to get an insight that other people did. He started to look at overcrowding, police brutality, chronic unemployment. It wasn't the issues that other people, the pundits, said that they were going on. These other things. But to get that insight, he had to go back and learn and do a Nieman Fellowship up at Harvard about how social sciences could be applied to journalism. More people who are interested in this space, go back to school. Lots of resources for that. Talk with subject matter experts at the schools about the data they're looking at. What's the context? What does it mean? I mentioned this earlier, but people are going to find the bugs in these kinds of apps, of these stories, of these investigations, more than they might others, because of the highly critical, very numerate, very skeptical audience that they attract. This is why 538 and Vox are getting hammered, to be honest. Yes, there was some hubris. They said they were going to be awesome, but the fact is they held this up, and now the whole data journalists in the world, the professors of the world, are coming in and looking at what they're doing. So if you quickly put something up that doesn't knock all the boxes down I mentioned earlier, you're going to get in trouble. This is important in the context of thinking what can be done quickly. Some of these stories will need to be slower to have more impact and to be right to hold up. And if data journalism is done badly, and we're seeing examples of that, it's going to erode the public's trust in the media even further. So slow down, get it right first. There'll be discussions later about this today, but if we're living in a data-centric world and making these applications, security is really important. So is protecting the data if it's sensitive. People will want more transparency about data being collected about readers. We just had a great panel upon metrics. They want to know if you're using those kinds of data in stories, how you're doing it, and maybe have buy-in. Anyone recognize this map from New York? This map of who had handgun permits in New York was one of the most important examples of where data journalism that was not ethical in all the ways it needed to be created a huge furor and led to laws being changed that limited the public's access to information. New York legislature actually acted to say that this shouldn't be FOIA-able anymore. Problem with this map is not that you had these data points showing where people had guns. It was that you could actually dig down, way down into the map and see names and addresses. Not necessary to the story, showing people's information in a way that didn't need to be, putting people potentially at risk in a way that they didn't need to be. You can easily think of, say, a woman who had been battered by an ex, who had a handgun now and is now searchable in a way she might not have been before. I got my hands on Google Glass. Okay, Glass, tell me about this story. As you think about the next generation of interfaces, whether it's iWatches, whether it's glass, whether it's something that's reflective on your clothing, whatever it happens to be, data is going to be part of it. And building things for it will be part of the work of people who do this space. I encourage you to go read the entire recommendation in the report on this. This has been a pretty hot topic recently. Fact is, diversity is falling in newsrooms right now. This is an issue that's even more difficult in this space because of the demographics around technology and programming and the tech industry as a whole. Now, I will assert and stand by this, that more diverse newsrooms, gender, race, ethnicity, color, creed, all the things that make up the American melting pot, make for better journalism. And you've seen examples of where stories where people didn't have the context for the communities they were reporting upon, didn't get it quite right. They missed something. They didn't think about something that they should have published or shouldn't have published. I will say that in the research I had the opportunity to do, I think that the news app community, the car community, the data journalism community, whatever you want to call it in the United States, is actually pretty good on this. That there's a lot of really excellent mentorship, that people are encouraging women and people of color to come in and learn, that there is a huge and important teaching culture there. It's better than the tech industry, a lot better, if you have any experience of what's happening with some of the online misogyny and the threats that people experience. But it needs to improve more. And as newsrooms think about building these teams and training people and paying people more to do these things, this is going to be an important part of the conversation. Last point. We live in a world where there's immense amounts of fear, uncertainty, doubt, distrust. People don't believe things anymore just because they're reported. We're ideologically polarized in the way we might not have been before, and to some extent, maybe technology is enabling that. It enables us to choose what we want to hear and what we don't. In that space, scientism and positivism are stepping up. Empiricism, people say, look, we have data that will tell us what's true when people don't. The fact is, data can lie too. Data can be wrong. Interpretations can be wrong. It can be presented in a way that is false or misleading. Dataism is now a thing, and not just because David Brooks wrote about it in the New York Times. There is a great rising tide of people who want to say that correlation is causation if you just get enough data. We need to think very carefully about embracing that and encourage anyone who's reporting critically to be a skeptic, to spend time thinking about all the points I made before about where things came from, who they were created by, who they're representative of and not. It's a map of the world at night. You could think about the people who are living in the lights and people who are living in the dark. Are we reaching all of them? Are we describing all of them? Are they able to benefit from this work as well? If not, there's a risk that this kind of work will empower the empowered further. If journalism is serving a public trust, if it's about the public interest, then this kind of work matters to reach everyone and to report on everyone. So that's where I'll end it. If anyone has questions, we have some time.
We actually don't have time. I think you guys got a window into Alex's mind. Try editing 30,000 words of that. But I actually think we should extend this conversation into the next panel, which is diving even further into the data journalism conversation. So let's take a 15-minute break. Come back here at 11:30 for our panel on data. Thanks.